Today, we're going to be speaking with Dr. Eli Merritt, who's a political historian at Vanderbilt University and also editor of the recently released collection of essays, The Curse of Demagogues, Lessons Learned from the Presidency of Donald J. Trump. It's really great to have you on. I appreciate your time.
Thanks. Good to be here, David.
So I think one place to start would be one of the big discussions that's now happening in the aftermath of the Trump presidency. And, you know, we're still waiting to know whether there will be criminal charges or not. And that may be part of this conversation. Did we learn that the checks and balances and safeguards put in place by the founders were not strong enough if we had a president interested and willing to do the things Trump did? Or is that too bold a statement to make right now?
Well, I think we learned that lesson in something else. The checks and balances that were put in place by the founders back over 200 years ago, as you know, with the Electoral College and the powers of impeachment and conviction and disbarment from future office.
Yes.
For very long, the Electoral College has not worked. And so the real truth is soon after the Constitutional Convention 1787, ratification 1788, political parties became the dominant instruments of our politics, and also they became the dominant instrument of checks and balances against demagogues and authoritarians making it to the presidency. So many things, I believe, failed in the years 2015 until continuing today. But the most significant failure of checks and balances, the most significant failure of gatekeepers against demagogues who become authoritarians, is clearly the political parties. Our political parties are woefully weak today. And we can talk more about sort of the origins of that, but they became relatively emasculated starting in the early 1970s when all checks and balances at the nominating conventions were removed.
Let's talk a little bit more about that. You know, I have not found anyone who disagrees with me that Donald Trump could not have won a Democratic primary. Now, the reasons why people might disagree with, my reason is a little bit crude, which is even though I'm neither a Republican nor a Democrat, I don't believe Democrats would have fallen for what Trump was offering, whereas the Republican electorate, by definition, did fall for it in that they made him the nominee in 2016. Is that one of the differences right now between the parties in terms of the constituents? And then are the differences between the constituents greater than the differences between the party structures?
I would say it seems very clear right now, at this point in our history, that the Democratic Party is the party of the constitutional rule of law. It is the party of ethical leadership. No party's perfect, and the entirety of the political figures, politicians in any party are not ethical. But I think it's a hard question to ask. Democrats would never elect Trump. But I think the most important thing to clarify here is that we have descended somewhat into what I like to refer to as a demagogic culture. And I would not ever remove the possibility that as the culture and the politics become more and more fierce, that some liberal-leaning demagogue might come along who has similar tendencies and angers and frustrations and a personality as fierce as Trump's. And if we get into this black and white thinking, if we think the other side is evil, I do believe Democrats are also susceptible to demagogues. That's why what we do in one party is something we should do in other parties. And again, I think the most important area of intervention, the most flexible point of intervention is the presidential nominating system. A lot of people don't know that very little law governs, certainly not the Constitution, governs political parties and the nominating conventions.
Right.
So it's just a matter of the parties deciding to make changes. And they could do some inter-party compacts to guarantee that each of them will veto the emergence of individuals who clearly do not support the Constitution, will not solemnly swear to uphold free and fair elections and the peaceful transfer of power and other things.
When we talk about,
to me, today, I think the Democratic Party feels quite safe. I really do. I agree with you there. But it would feel like hubris to predict over the next 10 or 15 or 20 years, if we don't clean some things up, that they could become susceptible to demagogues. I truly
Oh, I
believe.
agree. All of my assessments are as of today. And when we hear people say, when Trump would say at the State of the Union, the US will never be a socialist country, it's sort of like, never's a long time. Maybe not. I don't think next year. There's not too many socialists right now in positions of power, but I think never. We want to be careful with never. If we go back to 2016 a little bit, there's a lot of blame that is often placed for how everybody failed to stop Trump. And sometimes it's, James Comey doing that extra press conference to talk about Hillary's emails. That was totally unnecessary. That was the difference maker because it was so close. Or the media giving free publicity to Trump is what allowed him to keep accreting 2, 3, 4% every time another primary candidate dropped out. That was the reason. Or Democrats selecting a poor candidate in Hillary Clinton is what's to blame. Now, when it's so close, it's very hard to say one thing is to blame because any one of those things could make a difference. But given that, how do we assess the lack of ability to have stopped Trump in 2016?
I think that responsibility goes around everywhere, to our basic education system, to the structure of our news media, as you're saying, and in events like James Comey's release of the emails or his judgment about that are very significant. But I would again posit that the only surefire direction to go is for political parties to block the emergence of demagogues and authoritarians entirely from entering the general election. If I'm not mistaken, all of your questions related to the general election. And so there are reforms that can help to prevent a demagogue or authoritarian within the general election from succeeding. But they become for their base, religious figures and addictive figures. So the most important thing that can be done, if there were two things I would recommend, it would be first and foremost that the political parties do their job and return to the party having the power and the platform having the power and the candidate having to adjust to the platform, which I think should begin in both parties to have statements that surround the Constitution and the oath of office, for example. The other thing where we woefully failed is in the process of impeachment, conviction, and disbarment from future office. The fact that after January 6th, after 4 to 5 years of witnessing Trump's bigoted speech and damage to our nation, that 43 senators voted not to convict him, either shows they do not understand democracy, they do not understand demagogues, they do not understand that democracies can fail, or that they succumbed to the cowardice pathway of hyperpartisanship. So I think both play the role. So those are the two most important places for intervention. We could make an effort to at least educate our politicians to understand these phenomena better.
The interesting thing about that is what you describe is what many Bernie Sanders supporters say happened in the 2020 primary, and they don't like it. And what I mean by that is there is a story that's told, and there's degrees of truth to all of these things, of course, that despite the people wanting Bernie, the party coordinated. I'm now searching into my memory, but it was, I believe, Pete Buttigieg and a couple other people getting out at the perfect time to get Biden South Carolina, with which he built momentum to eventually become the nominee. We all know the story. And a lot of people are angry because they say, now, the people should have the power. Even if whether Bernie was destined to win or lose in a general election, it should be the people, not the party, that gets to decide. You're saying something quite different, which is actually the party needs to be the safeguard.
I'm saying something completely different. I believe powerfully in representative government. And representative government has always focused. Representative government with layers of democracy and layers of checks and balances has always survived and functioned better than pure direct democracies. So yes, what I would actually like to see happen in the reform I think would solve or get close to solving the problem of demagogues getting into the White House would be to let the parties pick the presidential nominees and let the people pick the president. That is, in fact, the way it was done for approximately 190 years in our country. And we switched that in the early 1970s, and I think we're living the consequences of making that switch. So I would have the people be very involved in voting. The people would vote for the delegates, and hopefully by ranked choice voting. That may be something you've covered on your program or not.
Indeed, indeed.
Ranked choice voting, and then the delegates would go a stepwise fashion to the way it used to be done is county conventions, state conventions, and then national conventions. I think today they would just go straight to the national convention, and there they do their work, just like we elect delegates to the House of Representatives in this country. We elect them to go up there and do work, which is to study the situation and make determinations. So the first thing these elected delegates would do is establish the party platform, and then they would determine which of the candidates who are involved actually will fulfill the mission of the party platform and not take over the party the way Trump has done. Most countries in the world in variations do something like I've just described. Very few countries have direct primaries, and I do believe they will continue to be arrows in our sides and possibly fatal to our democracy, meaning we will become a sham democracy, not meaning we're going to engage in ultimate civil war, but it's a sad thing for me to think we'll be a sham democracy. We're only a democracy in name, and otherwise corrupt officials are engineering everything behind the scenes.
To look forward a little bit, I'm curious about your assessment of what is currently happening within the Republican Party, in the sense that we have these very unusual circumstances in which this demagogue Trump made a very early announcement that he's running in 2024. He has barely left his home since making the announcement. It's unclear really what the case is that he's going to make for his next nomination. A guy who hasn't announced anything, Ron DeSantis, is actually leading Trump in some polling. The speakership fiasco from the last week has exposed it's no longer just pro and anti-Trump. Even within the Trump side, you've seen this division. Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert on opposing sides of that division. Is something fundamentally changing here?
I want to ask you to say more about that. Something changing in the Republican Party for the better or worse? Is that what you're alluding to?
Well, better or worse is more of a value judgment, but is the dynamic of it's the people for and against Trump and it's that simple, is that dynamic changing where you're actually getting even more fracturing, where the MAGA side is now dividing?
Well, I think what Trump has done is he has opened the mainstream of the Republican Party and the nation to some extent to what Nelson Rockefeller called back in the 1960s, this is his quotation, the lunatic fringe. So I think it's hard to predict the 20 Republicans who were opposing Kevin McCarthy.
Yeah.
I just think evidence a lot of qualities in general that are very destructive to representative government. It is grandstanding. It is not thinking of the best interests of the nation. It's a little bit of this lunatic fringe coming in. So where things go, I am not certain. I do know that we continue to have within the Republican Party the forces of Mitt Romney, who have been somewhat profoundly weakened, I should say.
Yeah.
So I don't know where the future of it is. My real hope would be that at some point that there will be a conservative party that splits off from this Republican Party, and that the American people decide that this way of living through demagoguery and lies and fear-mongering and hate-mongering is not something they want to, that we did that experiment, now we want to move on from it. That's my hope. So, but I do think Ron DeSantis, clearly there are criticisms of him. He's not a demagogue. If you just look at him speak, you'll determine that the man does not have the rhetorical talents and destructive abilities of Trump. Some people worry he could become somewhat authoritarian, but I've looked carefully at what he's done in Florida, and there's some questions there.
Yeah.
But, to my evaluation, DeSantis appears for the Constitution to be a much safer bet than Donald Trump. And Donald Trump, I think, something's happening for him. I think he's becoming somewhat deflated by what's happening, and so hopefully he will. He could implode and become more dangerous to our democracy, as we have seen with his comments about the Constitution.
Yeah.
But it's all quite unpredictable, as I'm sure you agree.
When we look in history, what sort of events have catalyzed realignments in parties where parties significantly shift?
I think what one discovers, I'm thinking of the beginning of the Republican Party in the 1850s when you asked that, there is a sense that there is a national crisis that someone needs to address, and the Whig Party, for example, at that time,
Yeah.
was determined not to be willing to go in the direction that the Republican Party wanted at that time. It was clearly
Hmm.
not an anti-slavery platform, but it was an anti-expansion of slavery platform. So a critical mass had been met there, where they felt this sickness has gone on in our nation long enough, and we cannot get traction in these other parties. And critically, back then, there was more flexibility in the system. Certainly, there was not this entrenched money in politics and the political industrial complex that makes it so hard to form third parties now. That's a bit of a challenge, and it's very worrisome that third parties can be wonderful things. And again, the Republican Party was a third party
Yeah.
that rapidly grew and did well. So I think it's crisis. And so it could be that the current crisis of demagoguery and authoritarianism and corruption that we're beginning to witness now, that could, in the hands of a Liz Cheney, for example, become a catalyst for starting a third party. And I think it should be done, even if predictions are it can't succeed. We need to see people do the right thing and make efforts in spite of the fact that there's concern that we are a hopeless two-party system.
Yeah, I could not agree with you more on that. The collection of essays recently released is The Curse of Demagogues, Lessons Learned from the Presidency of Donald J. Trump. We've been speaking with the editor, Dr. Eli Merritt from Vanderbilt University. Really appreciate your time today. Thank you so much.
Great to be with you, David.